that when they come to Canada, as soon as they step off the plane, they get mauled. So
3, 2. From high atop the world headquarters of Southeastern Fly, this is the Southeastern Fly Podcast. Thanks for joining us for this episode. Feel free to share it with your friends and fishing partners. Subscribe or follow so you'll be the first to know when an episode drops. If you find value in the podcast, drop by the Southeastern Fly store and explore the merch that fuels this podcast. So who are our guests today on this Wisdom from the Guides episode? Our first guest, you've heard his voice on the podcast previously. He's been fly fishing for trout and steelhead for most of his life. He grew up around a fly shop and has been guiding for about as long as he could row a boat. He is the host of the popular Wet Fly Swing podcast. Please welcome back Dave Stewart. Dave, thanks for stopping by.
Thanks for having me again. This is going to be awesome.
Yeah, we've been planning this one for a while. And we can't have a Wisdom from the Guides episode unless we bring in another person. And it's almost always, Dave, it's almost always 3 people, me and 2 others. And the 2 others are really there to keep me in line, that's for sure. But our second guest was introduced to fishing in England at age 6. He has a love for stillwater fly fishing and it's taking him all over British Columbia and Washington in pursuit of trout and char. His book, Fly Fishing Patterns for Stillwaters, is a bestseller. He wrote the Orvis Guide to Stillwater Trout Fishing. His entire family enjoys the outdoors and fly fishing in particular. Please welcome to the podcast, Phil Rowley.
thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this. This is going to be fun.
I appreciate y'all both taking the time out. We've like I always do, we've previously spoken and kind of got into what the podcast is going to be about and how we're going to run it and all that. So we're ready to go here. What I'll start with here is, how did this topic for this episode originate? And Dave, it kind of started with you and I when we agreed to do the smallmouth episode.
Mm-hmm.
And I released it back in December of 2021.
Mm-hmm.
And you had released it in earlier 2021, and I piggyback off of what you had done and launched it on my show.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, we had agreed that we would get back together and do another podcast, another episode between the two. We had no idea what we would do about it. If you remember, we were just kind of rolling with, hey, we had an agreement. We're going to come back around and do another podcast with both of us, and we were going to put it on my show. And then hopefully you'll put it on your show later down the road. But in late May, I was traveling and you were traveling at the same time. I was in Colorado. I can't remember where you were.
Yeah, somewhere in Eastern Oregon, probably.
And we got on the phone as we were both driving and we said, what do we want to do this podcast on? And we got off on a topic of Dave, you and Phil getting ready to go on a road trip. And during that call, we talked about a lot of different topics, trying to land on one.
Mm-hmm.
And after that lengthy list of topics, I was like, I'm going to circle back around to that trip. That sounds more interesting than anything we were talking about. So you kind of filled me in, and I said, fill me in on what y'all were going to do, where you were going to go, and that sort of thing. And you were going to stillwater fish, and we talked about midges, and we talked about all kinds of stuff around that trip. And we said, well, let's just do one on that. And not only that, let's bring Phil into the conversation, since A, he's knowledgeable on the topic, and B, he was going to be there kind of working with you, I guess. Is that fair?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we had a whole crew of people up there. Phil was kind of the lead teacher. So it was a full, from A to Z, Stillwater, 101. Yep. It was a full trip with a group of guys.
And then boom, here we are. We're all three on this episode. And we don't expect you to give away any of your best secrets, but by all means, give away your best kept secrets for us. Okay. We're going to start with the trip, and let's spend about 5 minutes each on the trip. And Dave, we're going to start with you, I think. Where did you go? Include the lodge and the town and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And how long was it to get there? So what I want to do is I want to take our audience and put them in y'all's shoes. And Phil, I'm going to come back around to you after Dave.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, we had the conversation. I remember when we were trying to figure out a topic, and that trip was coming up, and, right away I thought, I know a little bit about stillwater fishing, but I was like, Phil knows a lot about stillwater fishing. So I thought having both of us on would be a great chance for everybody out there to really learn from, one of the gurus, one of the stillwater gurus out there. So I'm kind of here more for like comic entertainment, but I'll fill you in on the background. I mean, essentially I'm in Oregon, so Kamloops, BC was the destination. If you drive straight up I-5 from where I'm in Oregon in about 9 hours, you're going to run right across into Kamloops. And it's one of those really amazing places. It's still water, lakes everywhere. It's beautiful country, mountains, so I pretty much took the day. Actually, I think I drove through the night, slept along the way, for a few hours, hopped up early in the morning and drove my way out. And yeah, when I came through Kamloops, I was blown away because I hadn't been through there in a long time. And I just forgot how cool of an area it was. So Kamloops, then you drive out of Kamloops, I think like 30 minutes, something like that. And you turn off on an old logging road and drive another like hour. And you're in the middle, what feels like in the middle of nowhere. I mean, you could literally essentially be in the middle of anywhere, Alaska, Canada, because there's not much around you. So that's pretty much it. We were at a remote lodge, beautiful lodge right in the middle of, the provincial park. Just this amazing place in Canada. So that's the short story of how I got there.
And Phil, how about you? Did you, you probably live up there somewhere, right?
No, actually, well, I used to live in British Columbia for 35 years. When I immigrated from England, moved there when I was 1969. So yeah, I'm old. 18 years ago, I moved to Alberta to pursue an opportunity in the fly fishing industry and sort of been there ever since. So, that move has not only taken me obviously out of BC, I still go back there a lot, have a lot of connections and a strong bond there still. But that move to Alberta is now, I fish basically all of Western Canada, Eastern Canada, United States, Western North America, and even to Argentina now. So, but my trip to where we stayed at Skacheen was very similar to Dave's in time. I'm about a 9-hour drive from the Kamloops area. I'm in Alberta, the province immediately to the east. So I drive about 4.5 hours west to the resort to Jasper, which is a national park, and kind of scoot through the Rockies, through the Continental Divide, and then run down one of the valleys for another 5 hours or so and get to Kamloops. And then you kind of double back up, as Dave said, a road that runs parallel to the North Thompson River until you hit Logging Road, which the name escapes me right now, but I'm sure it'll pop up about halfway through this episode. So if I blurt it out, I apologize. And it was about a 36 kilometers, so I'm guessing 25 miles up a decent logging road. I think it's still got some activity. So when you're on those roads, you're always coming around corners, a little slow. Stay very far right just in case, because if there's a logging truck coming, they come fast and they drive wide. So yeah, you get up there, and then we parked in an area. There's a little access gate you've got to go through, and from there about a 3.5 kilometer 2 mile or so ATV ride into the lodge, sitting right on the shores of Dagger Lake. And the lodge is pretty spectacular. After all that trip, you're expecting to drive into maybe a outpost tent camp or something. So to have a full service lodge with everything you could imagine from food and accommodation, it's pretty eye-opening if you haven't been there before.
Just for the audience, I checked flights, and I believe it was Vancouver. Is that right, where someone would fly into?
Yeah, that's probably the best bet because it's a major international airport. So that's probably offers the best access. All the major carriers go there. Then you would simply rent a car from the airport, and it's about 3 hours, 2.5 hours, 3 hours to Kamloops, up of good 4-lane, easy access. I'm sure Dave could attest that. Pretty scenic drive all the way up, and then you get to the town of Kamloops, and you got to then pay a little more attention to Google to get through the town and not end up somewhere you don't want to be. And then off you go. And the lodge itself does a great job of providing guests with directions on how to get there, both from the direction I came and from the direction Dave came.
Well, I checked flights from Charlotte, Atlanta, and Nashville because that's kind of those are the probably closest to our audience as a general rule. The majority of our audience comes from the Southeast United States, and those flights are anywhere from $500 to $800 into Vancouver. Then you have to rent a car like you were talking about. But yeah, so it's not terrible. It's not a terrible one. And you got to remember that that you have the conversion ratio for the dollar and the for the Canadian and the US dollars. So
well, yeah, 500 US is probably about $1.75.
It's not much. It's not much.
I'm just kidding, everyone. So
yeah.
yeah. You also have the option too. You could, if you didn't want to drive that distance, you could take a short regional flight up to the city of Kamloops, rent your car there. You know, you'd have, as Dave talked to you, about a half-hour drive or an hour drive or so into the resort itself. So just you're adding a connection, and you may, depending on how those connections work, it could add some delay to it. But your flight to Vancouver, rent a car and go is your quickest, most direct way to do it if you were flying it.
I think everybody's got a pretty good idea of where it is, what it takes to get there. It sounds like a long way off, but it doesn't feel like it's as far off as what it is when you first hear it. I did a little bit of research on Skacheen Lodge. I don't know if I'll ever be able to say that correctly, and I apologize to them, but really looks like a nice place to stay. They've got 9 lakes or something like that. A pretty good amount of lakes. All of them have boats, and it's pretty private. I mean, they don't allow too many people in there at one time, do they?
No, you basically once you're at the lodge, you're it. You are the people in that part of the country. It's up in, as Dave mentioned, in a provincial park, Bonaparte Provincial Park, I think it's called. And you are pretty well all alone. You'll see some moose probably. There are a few bears around, but they're just black bears. There's no risk of getting jumped or anything like that. I know some people are always concerned that when they come to Canada, as soon as they step off the plane, they get mauled. So that's not true. And we don't live in igloos. But it's very scenic, lots of wildlife to see. And those lakes, you've got a main lake right where the lodge sits. You have the opportunity to fish, or you can walk directly from the lodge or take one of the lodge boats and drive down the lake and park it at a dock they've made, and then get out and walk, anywhere from 20 minutes to probably, it depends, an hour, depends on what you want to do and how much you like hiking and stuff like that. But to some really good lakes within 20-30 minutes, Dave, was all we really we walked, right?
Yeah. So let's move on to the next question, guys. And I know somebody's wondering, why does David have a podcast on here about the Southeast and we're talking about Canada? So what we're really talking about is more still water fishing. And if you're still wondering why we're talking about fishing in lakes, we're specifically probably talking more about fishing trout in lakes than anything. Tennessee and North Carolina both have several deep water lakes that hold trout, and that includes Fontana, Chioa, Calderwood, Chilhowie, and Santilla lakes. Those are all pretty much on the North Carolina, Tennessee border or very close. I've spent some time at a place called Calderwood Lake, and just for Dave and Phil's information, all they did was they dammed up a creek or a river between 2 mountains. So it's very deep. Just to give you some context, there are roads under some of these lakes. There's also a railroad track and a tunnel under the lake. So that's how deep this is. They are super deep lakes. And I've been up there and I've fished. I did what I knew to do at the time. I think after we talk about this, I'm going to have a few more arrows in my quiver, if you will. But we found the shallowest parts of the lake and tried to fish that. And then we, like everyone would do, put on sinking lines and went around the outer edges of the lake as much as we could. It's a pretty long lake. I want to talk about gear. Try to keep in mind that these are for the most part, very deep lakes. That may be where we end up, but also keep in mind that there's water in there for a pretty good ways that's maybe waist deep, maybe up to just over your head. So there's probably about on Calderwood anyway. That's the one that I'm very familiar with, the upper part of it. It's about a maybe quarter mile of not very deep water. And then it kind of drops off till it gets way down to the dam. So let's talk about gear. And what we want to do is we want to talk about rods, reels, and that sort of thing. And then I want to get deeper into terminal tackle, but I'm not ready to talk flies yet. Not quite yet. I want to kind of save that. Let's start with Phil, and then Dave, we'll come back around to you. But Phil, what are your suggestions? Give us, just 4 or 5 good points of terminal tackle and what rods and that sort of thing.
Rods are going to match your, it's obviously the fish you're chasing and the size of the flies you're throwing. My Stillwater trout fishing rods in the 5 to 7 weight range. I probably use 6s most often. I've had some experience up in northern Canada, the Yukon, Northwest Territories, northern Manitoba, northern Saskatchewan, Alberta, etc., fishing for lake trout. And they, member of the char family, and they do like to hang out deep, and I've successfully been able to prospect down 50, 60, 70 feet to get them. In those scenarios, probably I'm using, in those I was probably a little overgunned using an 8 weight because I was also there chasing other shallow water species like pike and stuff like that. So on a flying destination, luggage is always at a premium. For that scenario, for fishing deep, definitely had fast sinking lines in that 7-inch per second range, density compensated, so they're adjusted to sink tip first, get that nice straight connection between yourself and your fly. I also had some clear intermediate lines. As you mentioned, not all the fish are, way down into the depths. They are cruising the edges of drop-offs. When you look at trout lakes, lakes in particular, never mind trout lakes, but, the shallow areas of the lake, the shoal areas where the sunlight actually strikes the bottom, that stimulates plant growth through photosynthesis, which provides habitat for various food items. The whole circle of life goes on there. That's your supermarket of the underwater world, regardless if it's a bass lake, a trout lake, any of those things. That's where a lot of those species are going to go feed, or in their juvenile stages, that's where they're going to stay. And then when they get bigger and meaner, they can venture out into the rest of their world and have a better chance of survival. So you want to have lines to do that. And another line I'd never be without with fly fishing any lake would be a floating line, because it's such a versatile tool. I think most people think floating line and go, oh, dry flies, fishing on top. You mentioned poppers, those kind of things. That's certainly an opportunity. But we also do a lot of indicator fishing and long leader fishing at times, where we're fishing 15, 18, 20, 25 foot leaders sometimes. So that floating line combination gives me the versatility to basically work from the surface all the way down to 20, even 25 feet sometimes. At that really deep water, you are pushing the limits of that method. You're starting to get where sinking lines might be a better choice. So those 3 lines would be that's a good core selection of lines for any lake: a floater, the clear intermediate that sinks at about 2 inches per second, and something that sinks in that 5 to 7 range. And if you're talking those deep lakes you're talking about, I'd be in that type 7, whereas some of the trout lakes we fish maybe only get 30 feet, 25 feet deep. Then a type 3 or a 5 is probably enough. So there's a bit of local, variance you can put on it. And that's where I'd start. If you're going to be chucking bigger flies, anticipating windier conditions, those kind of things, you might stiffen up the rod a little bit from a 6 to a 7, or maybe even an 8 weight.
Knowing your lake, your depth, that sort of thing is critical, isn't it?
Yeah. So you would get that underwater contour maps, bathymetric maps. You can get those, online, government agencies, those kind of things. And of course, electronics are always valuable to have too. So whenever possible, I always like to have a sounder with me for just that reason. I think a lot of people call them fish finders. That's one thing they do. They do a lot of other cool things too, from marking GPS coordinates. Many brands of sounders now have actually the ability to build your own lake maps for you. They're mapping the bottom in conjunction with the depth recording of the sounder and the GPS and the mapping software that's in it. And it builds your own private personal map, because not every lake, and particularly out west where Dave and I are, we see a lot of small lakes that just, on the world stage are not that important to map, but from an angling perspective, we're certainly interested in them. So there's some valuable tools there that you can take advantage of to help because you really have to know for stillwater fishing. It's really important to know the depth, govern what fly line you're going to choose, how long you're going to let it sink, those kind of variables, so you can at least know you're in the park rather than just toss it over the side and hope for the best.
I think that's what we did when we first went into Colorado, was toss it over the side, hope for the best. We caught a few fish.
Yeah.
And they were very nice fish too. I was pleasantly surprised. But that was our strategy the first time. We went back with a little more knowledge the second time. But I don't know that we always chose the best approach, and definitely I don't know that we all had the best gear that we needed.
Mm-hmm.
So Dave, what's your take on this? And if you want to, you can even talk about what you took up there. So
yeah, I mean, ditto to what Phil said. I mean, I think I actually had a 4-weight this trip just because I had this new rod that I was kind of using. So I had that with the, you know what I mean? So I had the new rod, which was great. I had that. And then I had another, I think the other one was a 5-weight. And so I just had a 4 and a 5-weight. And yeah, I mean, we didn't get any like super massive, gigantic fish. So that was totally fine and not a problem. As far as gear, I mean, I've always been I love the intermediate line. That's always been one of my go-tos. And I think the thing I learned on this was like the like Phil said, the floating line with an indicator. I mean, that's probably the biggest take home here is that this is the first time I've used indicators on a lake setting. And it was super effective. I mean, right away from day one, when we got out there, we were doing that method after a little bit of research to find out what level the fish were at.
Right.
And then we were on them. It was kind of that quick. So, I mean, I learned a lot in the first hour we were on the lake. So, but it's pretty standard. I mean, Phil can speak a lot more to all the details and the gear and stuff like that, but it doesn't take much. I mean, it's really cool to think you can just go out there with a normal 9-foot 5 weight, right, in a dry line and catch fish, right? Probably even without a boat in some lakes in the right condition.
Yeah, well, and Skitchine was neat because what they have up there is natural, what we call natural recruitment, where the fish there are naturally reproducing. So they are wild and energetic. The lower elevation lakes that they stock, perhaps a little bit more productive, depending on the lake and the type of species they put in there. They do tend to get a little larger, but then you're dealing with still a beautiful experience. But Skitchine was quite remote. It was your lake for the day. Dave and I, the first lake we got to one morning, I'm kind of looking out there and rubbed my eyes a little bit and thought, man, those are big geese. And then we looked a little closer and it was 2 moose going across the lake swimming. So yeah, you're not going to see that on a more public, easily accessible lake. Generally not.
Yeah,
right.
But,
so that that adds a little element. We had eagles flying around all the time. There was always something to watch, which probably was a bit of a distraction, because then in the case of indicator fishing, you weren't watching your indicators. And one of the things I firmly believe with trout and fish when you're using indicators is they have periscope vision. So they know
they do.
The moment you take your eyes off that indicator, it's going under. And then you look back and it's gone, and you don't react. You just kind of lean in and stare a little harder. And then all of a sudden, whoop, up it comes again. You're like, oh man, I looked away for 2 seconds.
Right.
It's gone. Right. So you stare at it for another 30 minutes, something else distracts you, do it again, come back, it's gone. Yeah.
Well, I tell you, I found a way to combat that. So we're always trying to outsmart fish. So when I want to look away, I'll turn my hat on sideways.
Oh,
there you go.
Oh, and they think you're looking at them. I haven't tried that. See, you learn something new every day.
I'm not just another pretty face,
That's like the glasses behind the head for jaguars, right? When
and tigers in India. Yeah, I've seen
India,
right. Faces on the back.
Thing. Yeah, exactly. So what's the one thing that you think probably someone would not think to take that they probably should have, other than the indicator? And I think we did some indicator fishing on Calderwood when we were there, but we were also fishing that more shallow part. But what's the one thing that, and I'll start with Dave.
I got one definitely, again, another one that I've had these things in my box for years. I just haven't implemented them really on lakes ever, but a bug kit, a little vial and a pump, a throat pump, right?
Uh-huh.
So that was a big part, because when we got that first fish that was, big enough, Phil went down and pumped it out and popped out a bunch. We knew exactly what they were eating and what color they were, right? And they were the chromie. Some of them were the chromies. So we knew, like, okay, the size, and you know what I mean? And that's what was I catching the fish on, right? We were fishing I was fishing kind of a flashy little chironomid, and it was because of that throat pump. So I think that's one great thing that everybody should have.
That is a critical tool, because it's, and we only use it for, trout that are between, I'd say 14 inches and 20 to 23. After a while, they get so big and large, I almost joke, you can just stick your head down like a lion tamer and have a look, because it's only got so much length. But it's such especially Dave alluded to the chironomids or midges or buzzers, depending on where you are in the world. They are they are the key food source out on Western still waters. And you'd be amazed at, I fish some waters in Eastern Canada, United States, Eastern lakes, and they pop up on the menu there as well. People just don't, maybe not in the numbers you see in some of the, other lakes around the continent, but man, that throat pump, especially with that, because with chironomids, they can change, almost on the hour, flip from a different color to a different size. And it allows you to stay in touch with them. So it tells you, obviously, as Dave mentioned, what they're feeding on, whether they're actively feeding, because the sample you'll squirt them into the vial Dave mentioned, and they'll be wiggling around like mad. And if you leave them alone, they'll hatch and emerge. So I always joke in some of my seminars that through the careful use of a throat pump, that I've probably saved millions of insects' lives that have gone on for careers and, and had families and stuff. But also it'll tell you when you understand the food sources and where they live, and you get a sample, you can use them to predict where the fish are feeding. So if you get a sample that contains not only the pupal stage that Dave was talking to, that are all inflated with the gas that helps provide, they get quite bright, that provides them buoyancy and helps both their ascent to the surface and transformation into the wing stage of their life, but also the larval stage, which we call bloodworm, live near the bottom. So if you get like a sample like that, that's telling you the fish are right near the bottom, and that's where you need to put your flies, because where one is, the others aren't far away. So, they kind of hang around in loose little groups. And once, as Dave mentioned, once we had the depth dialed in, it was almost a fish a cast.
Let's walk through the stages of a chironomid or a midge. Sure. Let's walk through that, because you had a couple of good little tips in there that roll off your tongue pretty easily.
I have a love for these things.
yeah, I can tell.
Some may call it an addiction, but I'm in therapy. I'm doing okay.
So let's start at the beginning of their life, and then I want to talk about how they ascend to the surface, where they slow down, that sort of thing. All that type of information. Let's get on midges for just a minute, or 10.
How deep do you want to go? They're a complete life cycle. So egg, larva, pupa, and adult. Let's start with the adult lays the eggs. The adults look like mosquitoes, but the females don't bite. They do not need blood for their egg development. So, you'll see huge swarms of them flying above along the shoreline. The females fly into those swarms. Mating takes place. The males die soon after mating, kind of like a mayfly. The females will wait until usually early morning or evening, when the light levels are low. The risk of getting picked off by birds is reduced. The water is calm. They're not going to get swamped. They'll release their eggs either just by dipping the tip of their abdomen into the surface, or sometimes they'll kind of bend their abdomen like a finger and drag it across the surface to break the surface tension, and then drop the eggs. The eggs are demersal, so they fall down through the water. A lot of times, depending on the species, they can hatch as they're descending, and then they hatch into the larval stage, which is commonly called out west a bloodworm, because many species have adapted. They live in oxygen poor conditions. They feed on detritus, decaying vegetation. I think there's few species that may be predaceous, but for the most part, they just feed on the detritus, which is rotting plant matter, which whenever you have something decomposing, it generates heat and consumes oxygen. So they're living in that environment. So they have adapted in their blood system, which, unlike humans, is separate from their breathing, right? So we take in air through our lungs, it's transferred to our bloodstream through the lungs and then dispersed around through our heart and everything. And then we exhale and all that stuff and recharge it. Aquatic insects are different. So they're totally separate, but they have adapted their blood system to accept an oxygen ion. And because their blood system is hemoglobin based, it turns them red, right? So they have this ability at times to be brilliant red, maroon, scarlet, but sometimes they'll transition back to their normal colors, which could be an olive coloration. So from time to time, we see these kind of weird red and green banded ones, much like a candy cane or a barber pole. But for the most part, they're red. Generally, the clearer the water, the more brilliant the red coloration. In the deeper muddy bottom lakes, lots of suspended matter, algae, those kind of things, they tend to be almost a maroon, claret, burgundy color, a deep, rich red, blood red, hence their name. Anyway, so they, depending on the species, and if you look at Western North America, there's over 2,500 species of chironomids alone, and they're just by species, they outnumber all the other food sources in a lake combined, right? Much like midges on rivers and streams. They're just a hugely tough in their own way and very diverse and live in a wide variety of environments. So that larva, it can, depending on the species, we've got some species in the West. These larvae are an inch or just over an inch in length at maturity. They're massive.
Wow.
We've also got, obviously, the tiny little species as well. So there's always a range. So they, depending on the species, their life cycle in the larval stage could be months. It could be up to a year. They'll seal themselves off, and they live in tubes right on the mud-water interface. There are some free-living species that'll live amongst the weeds, and they'll construct cocoons amongst the vegetation. They'll transition like a caterpillar does in these cocoons, and then they'll break free, and then they're in the pupal stage, which is arguably the most important stage. So this is the stage that basically ascends from the bottom of the lake where they transformed into this stage up to the surface. It's not as soon as they transform, they go. I study these little guys and gals in my own aquariums, and I had some pupa that were taking 3 and 4 days to finally ascend. So once they transform and are just come out of the larval stage, they'll suspend just, a foot to 3 feet above the bottom in these huge clouds all together. And I believe what's happening is there's a transition going on, because basically the pupa, if you can imagine, is like a bag with the adult inside. I think the actual entomological term is called a pyrate adult. So there's a chemical process going on that's actually a big word here called apolysis, but basically the skin, the outer skin of the pupa is separating from the adult inside. So when they transform, that adult can get out and doesn't get trapped. What happens is that creates space, and these insects have adapted to trap and gather gases beneath their pupal skin. And as Dave alluded to, that turns them, the closer and closer they get to emergence, both in development and as they ascend through the water, less pressure on them, they become shinier and shinier. They slowly writhe to start. And then as they get closer to emergence, they become more and more active, and they wiggle more and more and more. And they eventually get up to the surface where a split forms along the back, and the adult climbs out, and away they go. So, but in this pupal stage, they're incredibly vulnerable. They're rich in calories. They are so easy for trout to eat. The more bugs that get in the water, the more pupa, the narrower their feeding zone gets. So that's why a lot of the techniques we use are really focused on trying to figuring out where they are in the depth in the water, and then staying there. So indicators are probably one of the best ways to do that, because the distance between your indicator and fly governs basically how far down. And if you put your fly in the zone they're traveling through, you're going to get a lot of eats, because they're going through there like Pac-Man, just munching away, and it's very efficient. They're not a very, compared to a trout, they're a small food source, but there's so many of them. They're not going to chase them all over the place like they would a minnow or a leech or something larger, but it's so easy. It's like you and I sitting on the couch with a bowl of peanuts or jelly beans. You just can't help but put them in your mouth, because it's just so easy, right? And as we can all attest, especially jelly beans, you can certainly add on the weight. So yeah, so they're a fascinating bug. And, for such a simple life cycle and simple looking, there are, it's a science out west with color variations and the patterns and things like that. And it's a pretty addictive. Dave got to taste it a little bit. I couldn't whet his appetite too much. I didn't want him to get all crazy on me on day one. Turn into Gollum or something, and
Exactly.
Lord of the Chironomids chasing him around.
Oh yeah.
So Dave, what do you think the one thing or things were that you learned from about chironomids, midges, that sort of thing?
Everything Phil just described there. It's like I know a little bit of entomology, and Rick Hafley, who I know Phil knows really well, is an entomologist that I learned from, a long time ago as well. And So I know a lot of the knowledge there, but I'm just like skimming the surface. So being out there and fishing the chironomid and watching it hatch, like Phil said, on the surface, and that whole thing is really cool. I mean, and that's probably the biggest thing, is that level, finding out where they are, and then literally just setting your indicator so your fly is at 7 feet or it's at 8 feet, and you know it's there. And if they're not hitting it, then adjusting it up or down to get to that level. And then, so that's the biggest thing I learned, like really systematically getting, you're not just casting and stripping your thing up through the zone. Like I'm going to maybe catch a fish down the bottom, and maybe as I strip it up or something like that. This is literally like, we're at the level and we're going to stay there. And if we don't catch fish, then we'll just adjust maybe a foot or so, depending.
Yeah. It's amazing when you might be at a level where you're getting a fish every half hour and you make a change, and it's people sometimes, indicator fishing so boring. When it's going under every cast, it's anything but boring.
It's not boring.
And it's pretty exciting because there's only one thing that's pulling it down, right?
Yeah.
So, and it's a very, we'll probably talk about setup in a bit, but
that's what I was going to say.
It's very technical. It's not just stick a bobber on there and hope for the best. There's a real method to the madness if you want to get serious about it and get good at it.
And that bobber stuff, Phil, you guys have your little method, was something I learned as well. I mean, they've got a little Phil's method of actually getting your bobber so you could quickly adjust it, but then if you get a fish, it pops out. So you're not dragging your bobber all over. So it's just, you'll talk about that, I'm sure, but that's another tip.
I want to know about that for sure.
Yeah.
A couple of questions to follow up on that. They were talking about, and I will not get this right, but they start securing gas, you said, from their outer shell.
Yeah, just underneath their skin.
And then they start to the top. Now, I have always gone on the theory that you'll see the fish's back, not a head come up and eat, but you'll see the fish's back eating midges under the water.
If they're eating the emergers at the surface, because those pupa will come up and hang momentarily like a comma, and then they kind of elevate horizontal, then the split forms and out they come. So the trout can get tuned into one particular body posture, the comma, the laying flat, the kind of the adult is just crawled out with the shuck still trailing behind, similar to other insects, caddis, mayflies, those kind of things.
Similar.
But the majority, when they're on chironomids, we spend the majority of our time targeting 1 to 3 feet off the bottom, because that's where you've got, again, those clouds of pupa suspending. It's safe down there for the trout. They can be 6 feet down, 12 feet down, 14 feet down, 50, 60 feet down, feeding on these things. And, there's no predators down. There's no ospreys, loons, eagles, those kind of things. And it's very efficient. Like I said, once they find the level they want to feed at, all the food they need is right in front of them. All they basically have to do is turn their head slightly left or right and inhale. It's like you and I driving through a swarm of bugs down the highway on a motorbike. We're going to eat them whether we want to or not.
Right. So would you say, and let's transition over to a river just for a second.
Sure.
Would you say that they would do the same thing in a river, a slow moving river? Or I've seen midges hatch on 12,000 CFS in a particular river that we fish.
Pretty durable insect.
Yeah, they really are.
Yeah. I fished the Missouri River in Montana, which is a big slow moving tailwater, and midges are, and the same. I fished the Green in Utah. Yeah. Same thing, getting midges down near the bottom. They're always in the drift. They're always around. That's the other thing too, whereas a lot of other insects can have these focused emergence periods, a couple of weeks or something like. Basically in lakes, as soon as that ice, if the ice comes off, the shallows warm first, you'll get smaller, tiny midge species, chironomid species hatching then. And then as the lake warms, the hatches just start sliding and going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. There are a few exceptions where we've got a lake in British Columbia I fished that is known for its deep water, like 40, 50 feet down in May, which is not typical. That's atypical, because typically that deeper water hasn't had a chance to get any sort of influence from the sun. You could argue probably after about 30 feet, it's not getting any influence. But anyway, there's enough things. It's generally things happen from shallow to deep. Right. So as things warm, they're present all the time. So you can, in rivers, because you're dealing a lot of times, I've been on the Missouri and the fish are midging, taking both the emerging pupa and the, basically they're up on the surface in this feeding rhythm, and anything that comes in that zone, whether it's an ascending pupa, a hanging pupa, a transitioning pupa, an adult, if they're not too focused yet, they'll eat anything that just gets in their zone. right, and go for it. So
Right. So, and I want to back up just a minute and talk about bloodworms. I don't want to go a long ways. And here's the reason why, and shame on me. One of our Wisdom from the Guides episodes, I was talking to a couple of brothers out in, they fish in Idaho and Wyoming, around Jackson Hole, I guess, and around Driggs and that area. They were talking about bloodworms, and I cannot remember around here, and they're actually from Nashville, but I couldn't remember catching a fish around here on a bloodworm. And I fished with people, that fish these big, just like we were talking about, inch-long bloodworms and that sort of thing. Yeah,
they often get mixed up with your San Juan worms, which are a true aquatic worm. They're more related to leeches. They're probably, we call them bloodworms in the West in our lakes because of their coloration, but really they're midge larvae or chironomid larvae. They are the larval stage. The bloodworm is the sort of common nickname that's been stuck with them, because the majority of the species I run across are that red coloration, but there are other colors. In rivers and streams, you will see the red ones. I've seen tan ones. I've seen green ones. Okay. And your midge species in rivers are generally a lot smaller than what you see in lakes. That's one of my votes for lakes. Our bugs are bigger. We don't do size 24s.
Yeah, that brings it all together now. That's making more sense. So I haven't caught them on red, but for the most part, but I have caught them on other colors. So I guess you could make a stretch for me to say that I have caught them.
Because our red is that common coloration, that's the common nickname they get given.
And I've got a friend that fishes red all the time, does real well on it, but mm-hmm. I don't. I mean, I don't do very well on red at all. So could be a way I'm holding my mouth. Maybe. I don't know.
That's it. There's a secret for everyone to tune in. It's all about mouth position.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. That right there was something all that information that you just gave us, to me, I think a person could listen to this and pick through it and not only help to adapt to a Calderwood and that sort of thing, because there are midges up there, but also use it in some of the rivers in the South that have midges, or use it where they fish midges, I guess.
I think people sometimes think chironomids are a different insect than midges.
Yeah.
In England, they call them buzzers because when those adults form those huge swarms, there's such a volume of insects that if it's, a calm day and there's no, high, background noise, you can hear the whine of the wings together. Wow. And it's almost deafening. Dave, down your way on Diamond Lake one time, there was so many midges happening in the parking lot. It looked like clouds, literally cumulus clouds of these insects swarming around. A little breeze would come up and dissipate them a bit. And as soon as the breeze stopped, boom, they're all back together. The sky turns white. And then I walked down to the shore and I'm standing at the launch area looking down, and the lake was a little windy. And it looked like, okay, it's been windy for a few days. It's churning up mud along the shoreline because it was this 3.5-foot band of what appeared to be mud. And I went down and had a closer look, because the closer I got, the more mud-like it did not look. So if that makes sense. And then I went down and put my hand in it and shook it and, kind of sifted it through my fingers. It was the shucks of the pupa. There was so many shucks that had come ashore. They were forming a band of about 3.5 feet wide. And also there were shucks that had rolled up on the beach like driftwood, or seaweed that you would see. Like there was just so many coming off. It was a little worrisome that when we went out on the lake, would they still eat a chironomid? Because I think every creature on the planet, as I said, the jelly bean analogy, you eat enough, you're like, I'm done. I do not want another. I'm going to be sick if I eat another one. But they were quite playful that day and would eat chironomids. But the next day, they didn't want anything to do with them. We had to use something else. They were just like, I'm sure they were like, God, not another chironomid, please. I'll eat anything else, just not a chironomid right now. It's like kids after Halloween, no more chocolate for
I have been. I'm not going. Everybody would know what river it is, but I'm not going to mention it. I don't want to send anybody down a wild goose chase. But I've been on one of our rivers here in Tennessee that it was foggy about probably 2 hours before dark, and was floating down the river, and it's just a huge midge hatch happened, and there were so many midges on the water that you could look across the water and it was absolutely covered with them all the way across the river, a pretty good sized river. And when you would dip your oar blade into the river to take a stroke, it would make a clear spot of midges in the water so you could see the bottom. That's how many were there. It looked like, it almost looked like snow on the river.
Yeah, it's staggering when they're, when it's one of those years or one of those species, it's just overwhelming how many there are. It's just, I've been in hatch situations in the West. I remember sitting on a lake with my son, my oldest, he's 29 now, but at the time he was about 10 years old. And this was pre-buff, so we had to literally sit with our hands over our mouth like this. And I remember we had a little snack mate cooler, with our sandwiches and stuff in it. And it, blue sides, white lid, could not see it. There was so many adult chironomids just packed on top of that thing. And it was just, you had to talk like this because you were going to eat. I probably did eat half a dozen that night. Frankly, I don't see what fish see in them. They kind of make gack and spit a little bit, but they love them. So yeah, staggering numbers.
Oh, so Dave, do you have them pretty thick around where you are, or how is it out there?
I guess like Diamond Lake is definitely in down
Crane
south.
Prairie,
yeah, Crane Prairie,
East,
yeah, we do.
Yeah,
I guess I haven't noticed it quite as much, but just because I haven't been keyed in on it, But yeah,
you're too busy stepping and swinging.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm too busy focusing on other things. That's what it is.
No, and they really, there's different habits. They're very diverse. They can adapt in a wide range of habitats. But if you've got lakes with rich, muddy bottoms, they really like that stuff. That is preferred habitat. And as Dave saw at Skitchine when we were fishing one of the lakes there, pretty muddy bottoms, and that's going to be good chironomid habitat and good hatches as a result, and fat and happy fish. Chased by fat and happy anglers, maybe.
What about flies? Let's move on to flies. And Dave, I want to start with you. What were your selections of flies? I guess if I was fishing with Phil, I'd just say, dude, just tell me what I need, and then I'll, crack open another beer and make it happen.
Well, you're my kind of fishing buddy. Yeah. You bring beer, I'll bring flies.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. The selection for me, and again, I was kind of living through Phil and Greg and some of the other guys there, but I mean, like Greg's box and Phil's were just piles and piles of different sizes of chironomids but there were some other ones that I know we like. The booby is always a fun one to talk about. That style of fly, that's a totally different thing. I'm trying to think of the one we used that we did that one day. It was kind of like, it was almost like a dragonfly. I guess it was a type of a dragonfly pupa, not dragonfly, but that nymph we were using.
The Gompus?
Gompus. Yeah, the Gompus.
Yeah, that's a common name for a Western pattern. It's spun and clipped deer hair, and it imitates the spider-like bottom, the sprawler species of mayfly, dragonfly. Imitates the nymphal stage. So dragonflies are a key Stillwater food source because they have really prolonged nymphal cycles, 3-4+ years. Wow. So they're like the stonefly, if you will, of the Stillwater world, and they get big. They have they're a food source trout see a lot throughout their lives, and of course it's a giant, T-bone steak going through the water.
And it worked. It worked. That one day there was a hatch going along, kind of towards the shore along this whole shore, and we just went up at the top and pulled the anchor and just slowly drifted down. And I was fishing, and and then we switched, and then the other person, Phil, your friend there,
Kevin.
Kevin in the boat, he was rowing and he was getting me in, and I was getting fish. I mean, every time I made a good cast, it was fish on. It was a lot of fun. And then the other fly would add to that, so I'd have the chironomid, the Gompus, what's the exact name again for that, Phil?
The dragonfly nymph?
Yeah,
it's a pattern called the Gompus.
The Gompus. The Gompus. So it was that, and then the other one was the just your standard Adams parachute.
Yeah, we did.
I had Adams I put on, and I mean, literally, it got so eaten up. The hackle got sprung, and it was just sticking straight up. And it was one of those days where it worked. Didn't really matter.
As long as it floated and created a decent silhouette, they were on it. And that's one of the traits of those Skitchine fish, because they're wild. They're more surface orientated. They just the way they have evolved that they will come up and eat a dry even when there's no appreciable hatch or anything going on. And I had in my boat that day, I was just up from Dave. I had, a pretty good, a seasoned angler and somebody that that was his first time ever with a fly rod. And it was a great teaching tool for him because he didn't have to make long casts. He could basically just pick the fly line up, drop it down, do a roll cast, drop the fly down, let it sit. Fish would roll nearby. I said, give it a twitch, even though, technically mayflies don't twitch, but that's the fish just drew attention and within seconds, boom, he'd eat it. And he's catching fish and he's having a blast, right? And now he's hooked for life on fly fishing, I hope. So
how fun is it? And I love this part whenever I guide new people, and a lot of guys are like, I don't want a newbie. I don't want to have to teach somebody, but those first 3 or 4 or 5 fish, first fish to the 4th or 5th or 6th fish.
Yeah. Well, that was for me.
It's the best thing ever.
Oh yeah. It was, after, fishing conventionally for, basically through my youth with all that weight and all the stuff that goes with that stuff. And then to get your first fish on a fly rod, it's like, it's nothing. There's no loss of sensation due to weight or the rest of the gear. You feel like you just hooked onto a whale or something, right? You get it in and it's like, wow, that's pretty small actually. But wow, that was fun. Let's do that again. And I think I get that, I try to do that with my students from raising my 2 sons, right? Is if they're catching fish, they'll fish with you longer. Therefore, dad gets to fish longer. Yeah. In addition to all the junk food they get to eat, play with the dog, whatever it takes to keep them happy as long as you can. But if they're catching fish, and that seed's planted for life, even if, like most of us at age 16, other influences came into our lives in the form of cars and the fairer sex. And, then we come back to it later in life. Right. So,
So what about, all right, I want to talk about a couple flies here. One, Phil, or Dave, you said Phil has a special setup for indicator. And then I definitely want to talk about the booby fly because I've heard about it, but that's it. I mean, that's as far as I got because at the time I wasn't into fishing lakes at all. Yeah. Let's talk about that.
Well, let's talk about, because Dave mentioned that the indicator setup, and I think, and I touched on it earlier, that sometimes people unfamiliar with it think, well, that's pretty simple. You just put the bobber. I always joke, what's the difference between a bobber and a strike indicator? It's about $4.99. So, fly fishing, we use the indicators, but
exactly.
To me, the indicator is such, and I learned to fish chironomids pre-indicators, on the fly fishing evolutionary scale. It's probably one of the newer methods, but it controls 2 of the things I see beginning stillwater fly fishers struggle with, and that's getting their fly to the right depth and keeping it there, and then controlling the retrieve. Because, and no disrespect to our river and stream brethren, particularly streamer fishermen, it's so much more dynamic. They're walking, they're wading, they're casting, they're stripping, and they're just, where stillwater fishing is a lot of times, okay, we're going to cast it out. How long do I let it sink? Well, it's going to take 20, 30 seconds for all that to sink below the indicator. You got to wait that long. And then you got to just either, as Dave saw, sometimes you just let the natural chop that the wind creates just to fish your fly for you. And within a few seconds, that little fly underneath is, because it's being influenced as the indicator, gets in that little, what we call the chironomid ripple, the chironomid chop, just dances nicely. That fly is just seductively wiggling and moving like the naturals. Boom, indicators down. So the indicator is critical for that. But the most important part is the leader setup. It's the most complex leader setup I use on lakes, because the most critical thing with indicator fishing is you have to have level, same or similar diameter tippet material, leader material from the indicator to the fly. So when you set it for 10 feet between indicator and fly, it hangs straight down. A lot of times people will take your standard 9.5 and a 12-foot leader, which is in the trout range, is primarily designed for fishing to rising fish on rivers and streams. Half of that leader is butt section to facilitate a gentle dissipation of casting energy. The fly lands delicately, you don't spook the fish. But when you have a leader that's like a fly rod, thick at one end and skinny at the other, the thicker stuff sinks slower than the thin stuff. So I've had scenarios where I've had 2 anglers in the boat, one fishing a level setup, one fishing a tapered setup, both fishing the same fly, the same way. The indicators are sitting, straight downwind, 3 or 4 feet apart. So there's no magic fairy up there anointing who's the lucky angler that day. And the difference is the leader setup, because one was using a tapered leader and one was using a more level setup. And even though both set to 10 feet down, the one with the level setup is straight down to 10 feet. The one with the tapered leader, it's coming off the indicator and then sort of drooping off in a bit of an arc, which is robbing that presentation of depth. And it could be, as I talked, it could be a 6-inch variance, and that's all it is. And
Right.
the fish just aren't, they eat a lot of those things, but they're not going to chase one all over the lake to eat it. If it hangs in front of their nose, it can't help themselves, right? But they're not going to expend the energy. There's no reward for them to spend that energy to eat that small food source. So that leader's construction is crucial. So I use the Rio indicator leaders, but other brands out there have nymphing leaders that you'll read on the package. It says tapered leader. So, it's tapered, but not like your standard 9.5, 12 footer. About 3 feet is butt section. And then the rest of it, the Rio ones come in 10-foot length. So the final 7 feet is level leader. So the butt section gives you, you put your indicator. I like to position my indicator within about 3 or 4 feet of the fly line. You've got all your weight in one, concentrated in one area. When you start moving that indicator out to the extremities of the leader, it becomes unbalanced. It becomes difficult to cast. These level leaders are tangle prone, particularly if you're in an area where you can use multiple flies. You overpower your cast, all kinds of bad things happen, as we know. And so you keep your indicator close. And so basically right where that leader transitions into that level section, that's generally where I put the indicator. So between the indicator and the fly line, I have a bit of backbone to help turn this over. The leader is nylon based, so that is going to sit in the film or on the surface. So when I react to a take, I don't have to kind of pull the leader up through the water a little bit because it's sunk down under. And also, if you're using a loop-to-loop connection to your fly line, the thicker diameter butt is not going to cut into that coating of the fly line. There are some, and you can certainly do it this way, that use total level leaders. So they'll make a leader entirely out of 10-pound, 8-pound all the way, and it certainly works, but there's always a risk you're going to cut in to that coating. Now, some add a little extension and then tie to, make a little butt section of about a foot and put a loop in it. And it's just, to me, another thing to go through the guides. Right. So this works very well. Of course, so I mentioned I've got 7 feet of usable leader. Now, of course, we indicator fish to 20, 22 feet sometimes. That's sort of, I think, my personal record, 22, 23 feet. So obviously I'm going to have to add some tippet. So the way this leader works, just in summary, and I'll come back to the bits just so it'll go full circle. It's kind of like a Quentin Tarantino movie. It's it'll come together in the end. So you've got this indicator leader. And then if I jump to the final tippet section, I always like it about 2 feet long of fluorocarbon. So I have 2 feet of that final tippet section. We use a lot of small barrel swivels, size 12, 14, 16. They add weight, they rotate, they help reduce tangles. The releasing indicators that we like to use in this method that Dave talked about earlier, if you break a fish off, they will slide right off the leader, so that swivel acts as a stop. There are times fish will eat the swivel and you'll get a pull down, or you'll accidentally foul hook a fish on a stationary presentation, which you think is kind of weird. And what's happened, the fish has taken the swivel, you recognize a take, you set, you pull the fly up into them, and you got them foul hooked. So we have that. We've got 7 feet off the leader. I've got 2 feet of final tippet section. So in between that swivel and leader, I need to add leader to get me to the depth I want to get. So my rule is, let's say the depth I want to get is 15 feet. So 7 plus 2 is 9. So if I take that 9, that's constant throughout, and subtract it from my target depth, that tells me how much leader I got to add. So I need to add a midsection of 6 feet of equal or maybe one step down tippet, typically fluorocarbon. And I call that the adjustment zone. That's my nickname for it, because that's where I ebb and flow the overall leader. So if I hit 15 feet and I have some success and then they slide out deeper for whatever reason, I'm going to have to add to that midsection. Conversely, Dave calls me over and says, Phil, I'm getting them 8 feet down. I don't want to be fishing, because I'm going to be fishing a 10-foot leader plus 6 feet plus 2 feet. That's 18 feet. I don't want to be fishing 18 feet when I only need 10 feet a leader to do it. So
Right.
I can cut that midsection out. That's why I call it the adjustment zone. So that's the basic leader setup. Now we add the components. So we got the fly on one end. We've got the swivel I mentioned, always about 2 feet above the fly. It just, again, makes that cast more. It's like two droppers, right?
Right.
And we do use droppers on, we're legal. I position those just above the swivel on that adjustment zone is where I position them. I can come back to how I do that in a second. Then we put the quick release indicators on. Now these indicators have a black peg with a hole drilled through it. So you feed the leader through that hole. When you get the indicator to where you want to position it, you pull that peg out of the indicator, expose about 2 or 3 inches of the leader. And then when you push that back together, you kind of don't allow the leader to move in the hand you're holding the indicator with, and that will cause that leader to buckle and form a loop. So you take that peg and pinch that loop against the inside hole of the indicator, about a 5/8 or so, 3/4 of an inch. And that loop holds the indicator in place. But as soon as that leader comes under tension, that loop will pop, that indicator slides free. So now you can fish 15 feet down and not have the indicator all jammed up at the rod tip, wondering how you're going to land this fish. And as Dave alluded to, between the indicator and the fly line, we slide on. The first thing I put on that indicator leader I talked about is a little rubberized bobber stop, the same bobber stops that conventional anglers use for slip bobbers. And we slide that onto the leader. They come on a little plastic disc with wires on them, and there's a little loop. You stick your about 2 inches of leader through that loop. You slide the rubberized stop off the wire. It's going to fold that leader over momentarily. You keep pulling on it and pulling on it. Eventually the little tag end pops out, and you transfer the rubberized bobber stop from the wire loop it was dispensed on up onto your leader, moisten the leader so it doesn't build any friction, slide it as far up the leader as you can. And what that does is once we get set up and, Dave and I are out in the boat together and I'm going to fish 12 feet down and he's going to fish 10 feet because we often experiment, two people working on the same problem to find the right depth. Once the indicator is positioned, I will gently slide that bobber stop down to the top of that indicator. If when that pops and releases, I release the fish, I want to get back in the game. I don't have to measure anymore. I just slide the indicator back up to the little bobber stop, engage it, and we're fishing again. Right. So I always call it a bit of a paranoid protector, because if you catch a fish and you don't get one for about 10, 15 minutes, that little nagging voice in your head starts to wind you up. And you start doubting yourself, right? So that's the basic setup. But the most critical thing is level leader from indicator to fly or flies. So when you set for a depth, it's going to hang straight down. You use a standard 9, 12-foot tapered leader, you're not going to get that. Right. Yeah. And when maybe if you're using bigger flies, like we fish balanced leeches and minnows and larger bugs, fish, trout, bass, pike, whatever, will move further for that. But a little chironomid, a little midge, although they're, rich in calories, they're not going to chase one all over the place. So you've got to get it in that zone and hang it there. And that's the best way. And that's the most complex leader I fish in still waters. So it's not just a jam a bobber on a leader and hope for the best.
I like to say, put it in their face, put the fly in their face and make them make a decision.
Yep.
So that's,
exactly.
And that sounds like that gets them down there. So I'm going to stop us right there and tell our listening audience that was a ton of information packed in about 5 or 6 minutes. Go ahead and rewind it, because I was following along. And Phil, do you have a website?
I do. I have, right now it's called flycraftangling.com. It's soon going to be transitioned into philrowleyflyfishing.com. Okay. But a lot of this is in my new book, The Orvis Guide to Stillwater Fly Fishing. Okay. It's in the floating line chapter. That chapter covers both indicators and a technique that I first used to fish chironomids, which is fishing long leaders without indicators, that we nicknamed the naked technique because it has nothing on the leader. And that's a technique where we're playing. It's a more finessey, it's more variables to adjust. But the one thing about learning that naked technique is it teaches you patience and touch, patience to let the fly sink, move it slow enough, and touch to recognize really, really subtle strikes. It's kind of the Euro nymphing of still waters, if I was to make that kind of comparison.
Right.
And once you get the hang of it, man, it'll improve you'll be a much more attentive angler to the little details that often make all the difference out there when you're fishing. So that chapter alone was 7,500 words. And I've got diagrams, leader diagrams, all that stuff in there. That's probably the best spot because you can read it over and over and over again and then send me an email.
Okay. Dave, how hard did you find that setup to fish? Was it difficult to make? Did you, first of all, if I was with Phil, he'd be making my leaders for me too.
Yep.
So I'm working my way up to 6 beers now is really what I'm doing. But how hard did you feel that was to tie up? Because it sounds super complicated.
No,
but I don't really think it is.
No, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, it's just a couple of pieces and keeping it simple. The long section, and then the swivel is the other new thing for me, right? Putting a swivel, which is another great tip. That it's kind of like the tippet ring, the same thing where it's an
inline weight system, right?
Yeah, and it's a weight and it adds a little bit of weight. So we were putting on a little a little split shot, a little
you had
tungsten.
split shot on.
Yeah, a little split.
Dave couldn't wait. Dave couldn't wait.
Right,
I couldn't wait. Yeah, but I guess you don't have to have that. I just tried to get down, but yeah, I mean, no, it was pretty simple. It was pretty straightforward. I mean, it wasn't like I've definitely fished other stuff more. I mean, I used to build my own steelhead leaders, right? And I'd be like, it's got to be this and all these steps, and really, it's not like that. It's
3 pieces. It's a main leader, a midsection, and a final tippet section. It's really not like any other leader. The only drawback to it is basically because it's almost level its entire length. It's tangle prone. It really has no taper.
Yeah, that's the thing. The casting.
But the beauty of indicator fishing is you do not need and you shouldn't make long casts.
Right.
So my general rule when I'm fishing indicators, the deeper I'm fishing below the indicator, the closer I cast. So I've been to this Crowley Lake in California, that's a reservoir down there, has some outstanding chironomid fishing. We're routinely fishing 18, 19, 20 plus feet below an indicator. And, you've got to be, when a fish takes a chironomid under an indicator, it doesn't plow into it like a bass would take in a frog or a pike eating another fish or even a trout eating a leech or something.
Right.
It's not an aggressive take. So sometimes they can take it so softly that indicator doesn't pull under. It goes half down, it slides left, it slides right. And if you don't have that indicator close to you in those situations, you're going to miss those takes. Or even if you see them, you're not going to be able to react fast enough to get that because you've got basically leader goes out to indicator and then straight down. You don't have any direct connection. You're not, 95% of your strikes you're not going to feel. There's always that one fish that just pile drives the fly for whatever reason. But you've got to keep it close. So most fly lines, like fly line choice is important with this too, because you can fish with any floating line, but when you buy a floating line for lakes, you're going to want to buy a line that's specifically designed with long leaders and indicators in mind. Like I helped Rio develop the Stillwater floater because we needed a line we need mass to turn that over. So it's got a short, aggressive front taper, a large, oversized head, a good back taper for roll casting. Because I'd argue the best cast for indicator fish is a roll cast because flies only come out of the water on that final push and roll over and flop it out there. And let it work. And so you're not going to be this is not a double haul. This is not 9 false casts because you're going to be consuming tippet and flies and sending me hate mail because, So as Dave can attest, half the time you pick it up. If you want to overhead cast, pick it up and lay it down. That's it. Just get it out and make sure indicator lands and you have all these, his split shot would land and swivel and then his fly. Make sure you see that separation. You know you're good.
Yeah. Well, Dave, let's back up and talk about this booby fly just a minute. Because you mentioned it. So let's start off with
I mentioned it, but it was more of a joke for Phil. It was more of a key to him because I asked it to Brian Chan, another guy that everybody should check out, very knowledgeable, had him on the podcast as well on our show. And I asked him that same question. I said, tell me about the booby fly. And we kind of laughed but I think Phil should actually, if we're going to talk the booby fly, I think Phil should actually do it justice and explain what it's about.
Okay.
It's another one. We have some desperate names in Stillwater fishing. The booby was a fly originated, I believe, by Gordon Fraser in England. And it's leech-like in appearance. It's usually got a long, a marabou tail that can be short or long, a body on it, and then a distinct set of round foam eyeballs, like a foam dumbbell.
Right.
And what this fly does is it's not a fly like a lot. There are flies we fly fish in general, but particularly in lakes, I call them attractors. I break my flies into three categories. Suggestive flies that are kind of that woolly bugger style. They could be one of 12 different things. They just look buggy and good to eat. You have your imitative flies that are designed to tackle a specific scenario. Chironomids, what we've been talking about, is a classic example. They want, a size 12 olive with a red butt, a silver wire, and a white bead, and this and that. That's what they want. You got to that's what your fly has to look like. And then there are those situations where the trout aren't necessarily feeding. So we got to trigger what a bass fisherman would often call a reaction bite. We've got to get them to eat something, so we're appealing to their aggressive predatory nature, their curiosity, their territoriality. We're getting them to, basically attack this thing for one of those reasons. So the booby is typically tied in bright fluorescent colors. It shakes and you drag it down with a fast sinking line. Because of that buoyant flies, you got to get them down. Now I have fished boobies on the surface as a waking fly, not only for trout, but for smallmouth. Because it's just, it's creating a wake and they'll come up and have a look. And it'll also, one thing about these attractor flies, when you use them in a team of flies, they will attract fish in to that team, and they may not eat that, the attractor, but they'll turn down or turn up the leader and see, oh, look at that nice looking natural hare's ear or that natural looking nymph, and eat that. But that's what the boobies primarily used for, is we fish them aggressively. So fast sinking lines, cast them out, let them sink, 4 to 6 inch aggressive strip pause retrieves to get that fly to move. As you strip it, it goes down. As you pause, it flutters up. As you strip it as well, the eyes cause it to wobble. And it drives fish crazy at times when they're on them. And the takes are usually very solid, right? So this is a technique. When we've tried that suggestive flies, nothing's worked. We've gone the imitative route. That's not worked. I want to catch a fish. Let's try and attract one in. And it's part of a whole family of flies that fall into that attractor category now. We have a fly called the blob, which is and all these flies, the common material in many of them is a chenille-like material called fritz that comes out of England. And it's got lots of there's standard fritz, jelly fritz, Daphnia fritz, slush jelly. That's it seems like every week there's a new fritz, and they're always better than the last one, and the other ones are pretty good. So these are fluorescent, they're translucent. They just, we use the blobs as well to imitate zooplankton when they get on them in the early summer and late fall. So we fish. A blob is just basically the body of a booby with no foam, and can have a tail on it. There's a lot of personality tires put in. We've got a cross between a blob and a booby called a fab. And this fly came about because in England, where these flies are so popular, the boobies in some fisheries were getting banned because they were so effective and people weren't using other methods. This is how I understand it. So they kind of, let's go back and fish the way fly fishing was sort of intended to be fished. So competitive fishing is pretty popular over there. So an intrepid Scottish team said, well, if you can't fish flies with foam in the front, because that's, I believe, how the regulation was worded, what if we put it in the rear? And I was like, well, we never thought of that one, so I guess it's okay. And so what they would do is they take the foam, the round foam cord that we shape these eyes out of, tie it in like a tail, and then split it so it's like a V opens up. It gives more buoyancy. And that fly, when you strip it, moves horizontally. When you pause it, the back end kicks up. So the fab, it's called, stands for a foam arsed blob. And what these competitors also did at the end of the day, because they've had a good day, they got to run the gauntlet at the launch. What were you using? Let me see your fly, blah, blah, blah. They would actually, at the end of the day, pinch that foam tail out. People think they were using a blob, which has a totally different look in action. Well, not totally different, but it doesn't have that foam tail, right? And then, of course, the mop tail has made it to stillwater fishing too. So if you take a bead-headed or a blob and stick a mop tail out the back, it becomes what the English call a watset, because the mop tails look like a watset corn chip, or crisp as they call it. right? That little mop finger looks like that. And now I started using more frequently a pattern called the apse worm, which looks like a plate of spaghetti or a spider going through the water, tied in these gaudy colors. It's got, basically a fluorescent thread body, olive, amber, red, orange, and 2 stretch floss, span flex, super floss, sexy floss, all those types of materials. 2 coming out about 1.5 inches long out the front, 2 coming out the back 1.5 inches, 2 out the sides 1.5 inches, 2 out the other sides at the midsection. This thing looks like a little spider. And yet when you strip it, those legs are just going like mad. And man, they work. I had a friend of mine over in Wales said, Reese, you got to try this, Phil, over there. And I was skeptical looking at that thing about, the size of a cookie in diameter. And go, I'm going to throw that in the lake and strip it around. But they love, at time, all these flies have their time and their place. And when it's on, it's, as Dave can attest with the booby, it's a lot of fun, right? Because they plow them.
Again, another ton of information right there. All in just packed into just a few minutes.
And again, all in the book.
All in the book. Okay. Yeah.
The operators are standing by.
Yeah.
I should be mentioning this is all in the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I really should. And I apologize for not
That's
mentioning
okay.
that more.
No.
And I put a link out there to some of this stuff. Definitely the book and Dave, definitely to your podcast and your episodes and stuff. I guess our one last question, and we ask this of every guest, all our guests ask it from, I guess we've been doing this for definitely since the first of this year, but what's the one question that we didn't ask that you believe would help our audience become a more productive stillwater angler? Dave, let's start with you.
Yeah, I got a pretty good one. Maybe it's a simple one, but I think it's a good one if you haven't done this before, which I never really did that much, is the anchoring. Right. Double anchor. I mean, some people, like for me, I'm a river guy. It's like you got anchor in the back of the boat, but in Stillwater, having the 2 anchors, and Phil, again, could probably talk more about this, but it just gets you, so you're not swaying around and you can, 2 people can fish. And so that was something that was, I mean, if people haven't heard of that, that was definitely a big one. But I mean, we touched on, a little bit of everything. There's all sorts of tips and tricks we didn't touch on, that we, maybe even didn't touch on the podcast we had previously with Phil.
Yeah.
But a lot of things. And again, it's probably in the book. And if it's not, then, we'll do another podcast with it. I think we're going to get Phil on again somewhere down the line.
That's a good idea.
The anchoring, particularly with this chironomid technique, you need to have total control of your casting platform so you can focus on the presentation, because depending on the method you use, the takes can be subtle. So that double anchoring, when we're anchored in the wind in a single boat, we put the heaviest anchor at the bow, put the bow into the wind, nice narrow profile. We use the bow at the stern to stop the sway.
Yeah.
Dave and I were fishing together in a boat, so we both want to fish out of the side, so we're not in fist fights 5 minutes in, because we're beating each other to death with swivels and bead heads. So we would put, in that scenario, I put the lighter anchor on the bow because it's lighter up there, draws less water. Put that one down first, and then let the wind, or use oars or an electric or however you want to do, to swing that boat perpendicular so the wind is hitting you square in the back. And then you drop that stern anchor. Now you can both fish out the sides, kind of. I've got, if I'm in the stern, I've got from noon to 9 o'clock to the stern, and Dave gets noon to 3 o'clock. Unless Dave misses a fish, then I get to cast in.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, that's all fair. Yeah. You missed him, you had him.
And part of that question, that question too, is like, you thinking out again, like getting to the spot. That's probably a big question. You get to the lake, where do you go? You got this big flat lake, where do you go fish? Right. That would be, that's always a good question to be like, okay, and are all lakes the same? Could you just kind of, and what do you do? Right. It's always a question for me and probably lots of people.
Yeah.
Got to answer that. Well, we be observant is the first thing. The day we went over, one of the things we looked for moving fish, and in short order, we rode away from the launch. We saw a couple of fish moving along the shore. We call it the 2 fish rule. You see one fish move, okay, 2 fish move, there's something there. And they're usually an indication if there's, because fish like to pod up in little loose gangs and associations. And where there's 2, there's probably more. They're active, and at least A, there's fish there, you feel confident. And B, they're active, they'll probably take the fly. And that was the case. But a lot of times I break it into 3 things: comfort, protection, and food, just like a river angler does. So comfort's all about water temperature. looking for the right temperature. So in stillwater trout fishing, every species is different, but I like to find that 50 to 65 degree range. That's a good range where trout are functioning, their metabolism, they're eating, they're digesting. And to me, that's very important. If a trout can't function properly, it's not going to eat. The analogy I use a lot in my seminars is if I ran the Boston Marathon and didn't have a heart attack in the first 5 feet, and I actually made it, and Dave comes up, congratulations, Phil, you made it. Here's a cheeseburger. You want it? I'll be like, not now, thanks. I'm trying to get my heart rate back to normal, get my metabolism back, and then I'll think about feeding. So those are the comfort factors. Weeds are important in there too, because weeds through photosynthesis, give off oxygen, springs, inflow streams, those kind of things. So a thermometer is key for that. Then the protection factors are the things that give the trout the sense of confidence, comfort to feed. So that's adjacency to deep water. We talked early on, you've got your local lakes where they've got the edges. So they'll come out onto the shoals, do some feeding. Anything spooks them, they're off into the deep water, into the safety of that. Points of land, drop-offs, weed beds again, because weed beds mask their presence. They can swim through them, over them. They basically almost disappear on them. The water surface has an impact. If it's rippled, it's going to diffuse and break up light. If you think like a riffle on a stream, same kind of logic. You can usually sneak up pretty close on a trout in a riffle without spooking it. Light as well. Trout, they will come in and feed in the shallows on bright sunny days, but they're just a little bit more wary. They're a little bit more in tune with what's going on, a little harder to get. That doesn't mean you can't get them. And then the third thing is food. Go to where the food is, and that's that shallow shoal areas. So in stillwater trout fishing in particular, we like that water that's 20 feet deep or less, because that's typically on most lakes, on average, the extent of sunlight penetration, 20 feet deep or less. The clearer the lake, yes, more sunlight penetration. That's going to stimulate the weed growth that creates the habitat where the food lives, right? And that's where trout go to shop. It's like, I don't know, I want to take Dave somewhere and kidnap him or something. I know Dave's got to eat. Dave's got to go to the grocery store sooner or later. I'm just going to sit in the parking lot and wait for him. That sounds a little weird, but
yeah.
Hopefully your viewers don't think, holy crap, what's Phil up to? He spends a lot of time in the snow. But it's just another one of my colorful little metaphors, just to illustrate a point. Yeah, so comfort, protection, and food, and then use your eyes and ears to kind of pull all of that in and figure out what to do. And those are important, because every time you go out on the water, whether it's the ocean, a lake, a river, a pond, whatever, you're learning every day, and you just want to keep that information, and patterns start to emerge. You start to see commonalities, because I get the good fortune to travel around North America and even down into South America and Argentina, and fish are fish. Thankfully, they don't know borders or taxes or politics or any of that stuff. They just eat, swim, and eat, and maybe get to make little fish some days. They all have similar behaviors. So, in the summer months, when it gets too warm for me on trout lakes, I go chase walleye on the fly, using exactly the same tactics, exactly the same gear. Strike indicators are slip bobbers. Casting and retrieving streamers is fishing crankbaits and spinner rigs. Similarities. Vertical jigging is the same as fishing a fast sinking line vertically and suspending a fly just above the bottom. Allows me to fish into deep water. That's that bare essentials. That's that dangling technique I mentioned. So, I target pike, bass, walleye, trout, all the same basic way. There's a little quirks they have, but you'll find there's an awful lot of commonalities that, techniques can be easily adapted to other species. So it's, even though I know we've been focused on trout tonight, hopefully some of your listeners go, wow, I can use that technique. I've got friends back east and eastern Canada that hang bait fish patterns under indicators and absolutely slaughter smallmouth with them. Say, this is the greatest method ever, right? And it's so deadly, right? It's slip bobbering. It works equally well for you just got to change the fly from a chironomid to, a leech or a minnow or, something that a bass or a walleye would be more interested in.
Yeah, I say if if there's a place on your river that you are pretty good at fishing, and you go to another river and there's something very similar to that, do what you normally do,
and you'll do quite well, and
you'll catch some fish that way.
Definitely.
So definitely the same thing here. Well, are y'all ready to close this thing out?
No, let's go on for another 4 hours.
Okay.
Sure.
I guess the one thing that I learned tonight was that I guess if I had to go back and answer the question, what was one question that we didn't ask that would help our listeners? And the one thing that I think that I would say is buy Phil beer and let him do all the work.
Sure. I like doing it. That's why I guide and do the schools. People ask me, how can you just sit in the boat all day and let two other people fish? Because I get a big thrill out of seeing them be successful and fall in love with this great sport, right?
Yeah.
That's not going to say some days I really want to, when I know there's fish to be caught and, maybe they're just still haven't developed to the point,
Right.
There's a little bit of energy in there that would like just to, but eventually we work through it and they get to catch fish. Dave was an easy student. He let me fish. I think he actually brought some beer too.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
He made me the perfect student.
He was my boat buddy for the week. As soon as, what are the boat partners? I'll go with Dave again.
Yeah. Yeah, we had a good time. We had a good time for sure. That was a good trip.
Yeah.
Well, let's go ahead and close this thing out, guys. If you find value in the podcast, share this episode with your friends and fishing partners. Drop by the Southeastern Fly store and explore the merch that pays for the Southeastern Fly podcast. So who were our guests today on this Wisdom from the Guides episode? First guest, you've heard his voice on this podcast previously. He's been fly fishing for trout and steelhead for most of his life. Grew up around a fly shop and has been guiding for about as long as he could row a boat. He's a host of the popular Wet Fly Swing podcast. Dave Stewart, thanks for stopping by, man. Appreciate your input on this one.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, I appreciate all your help getting it together, and it's good to talk to you again.
Yeah, anytime. Yeah.
Second guest, age of 6, he was introduced to fishing in England. He is, as you could tell, he has a love for Stillwater fly fishing and a love for chironomids as well. His book, Fly Patterns for Stillwaters, is a bestseller. He wrote the Orvis Guide to Stillwater Trout Fishing. His entire family still enjoys the outdoors and fly fishing in particular. Phil Rowley, thanks, man. I really appreciate you giving all that information. It's very, very helpful, and I think that the audience is going to find this to be a valuable episode for us.
Thank you, Dave. It was a lot of fun. As you can tell, I love talking about it. I do have one question for Dave too here. If he could row a boat since he was too old to remember, how come I had to row all the time?
That's a good question. That's a good question.
I think I got duped. I think he pulled out that beer and I lost my sense.
That's right. That's right.
You just listened to a Wisdom from the Guides episode with Dave Stewart and Phil Rowley on Southeastern Fly. See you next time.
I spend a lot of time. I fish into Wyoming and Montana and Idaho, Washington, Oregon, California, and I fish exactly the same way, right?
Yeah.
So the fish, like I say, they're not swimming around with there's no customs agents down there. Oh, can't bring that into this lake.
Right, exactly. So I think that especially when we got on that piece, but bringing them in the flights and the exchange rates and all that stuff, that's important for somebody that's looking for that little, I want to go somewhere, but I don't know where. And some people just like to go out in a boat and hang out. I love to go out in a boat and hang out. I love it. And a lake is a perfect place to do it. So.
Gets going quick and it just makes it fun. It's not mean or anything. Everybody's teasing each other and making jokes. And we had a little rock concert going in our cabin late at night.
That's right.
Classic rock.
That's right.
Oh, really?
Amazing. Oh, yeah.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, yeah. We had, so this is good. That's what surprised me about the thing is that Phil and I, this is the first time we had hung out, and Greg was the other guy, Greg Keenan. And was just a good time, man. We had I had as much fun doing that, just hanging out, listening to music and stuff as I did on anything, and so that's the stuff. It's like it's always that. It's like fishing, sure, it brings us together, but it's all that other stuff within the trip that just makes it, over the top.
Well, Dave, we get to talk about this industry too, right? It's
true.
Nuances and people we bumped into and run across. Make life interesting.
Talking about music, one of the best trips that I've been on was, we've got a group of guys. There's 6 of us. It's loose, so there's 5 or 6 of us. Let's put it that way. But we went to the White River for 3 days, and I can fish a couple days and then I'm fine. I could hang out by a campfire for a whole day, but on this particular trip, the first day we did a 12-mile float. It was a grueling march. We caught a ton of fish, and they were all in the places they were supposed to be. It was one of those days. And then the second day, I said, let's just do like a short float, like 3 or 4 hours. That's it. And then so we did that, and then everybody met back at the house. So we were right on the banks of the White. And we got out on the front porch and none of us are very good at playing music, but we had guitars, and I had a dulcimer and a mandolin. We had a bunch of different things out there, and we just picked around a little bit. And then we got into this thing of, here, what's this song and what year was it? And we had a ring toss game where it's on the rope and you let go and try to hang it on a hook. We drank some beer. I think we ended up eating 2-day-old pizza, because none of us wanted to drive.
No. 2-day-old pizza should be sold cold or 2 days.
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Like fine wine, it just gets better.